I'll go ahead and get the PowerPoint going. There we go. All right, so my name is Laura Griffin. I'm the Family and Consumer Science Agent here in Pueblo County in Colorado. So welcome and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Today we will be talking about canning jams, jellies, and fruit spreads. So there's 6 basic different kinds of fruit spreads. We have jellies, jams, preserves, marmalades, conserves, and butters. So just a little bit of definition information on each of those. First, we have jellies. So jellies are going to be made from the strained fruit juice of whatever fruit you're using. So they're not going to include any sort of solids or have any chunks of fruit in them. So because of this, their color is going to be really clear, kind of an opaque, clear color. And their texture is going to be the firmest of all of the fruit spreads. So it's going to be really firm. It's going to hold its shape when cut. It shouldn't be tough and it should still spread easily, but it's, like I said, going to be the firmest of our fruit spreads. And it's going to be the only one that really holds its shape well once cut. So there's some kind of pros and cons to jellies. The pros are that the presentation is really nice. So it gives a really pretty product in the end. You have a very uniform, kind of that opaque color. It's a really bright color a lot of times, depending on what fruit you're using. So if you're, selling products through the cottage food program, or you want to give these as gifts, jellies make a really nice presentation. They're very smooth. Like I said, they're a little bit more firm, but still very spreadable. Some of the cons are that jellies are a little bit more time consuming and they can be a little bit more work to make, just because we have to go through that whole step of straining the fruit juice. And that can take a little bit of time. And with that, you also need more fruit product to create jellies because we're only using the juice. So all of that other, the peels or the skin and the fruit, kind of the meat of the fruit itself, as well as the pulp, all of that gets discarded and is not used with jellies. So we're only using that juice. So if you're making a jelly, I highly recommend, trying to be as little waste as possible. So if you do have a lot of fruit excess, at least try to use that for composting or something. You can also take that fruit product after you remove the juice and you can actually make a jam with that. So that's kind of a nice compromise. You can make a jelly and a jam out of one batch of fruit, and you're lowering your waste that way as well. All right, so jams, I would say, are probably the easiest fruit spread to make. So if you're looking to just get started, highly recommend taking a stab at jams first. But jams are going to be a little bit thicker than jelly. They're made with just the chopped or the crushed or the mashed fruit. So the texture is going to be much less firm. So it's not going to hold its shape when it's spooned out of the jar. But again, it's going to be very spreadable and it's going to be much chunkier than the jelly. And like I said, jams are one of the easiest products to make because there is a lot of flexibility in them. So you can, chop up the fruit, you can crush the fruit, you can mash it with a potato masher, you can throw it in a blender if you want something a little bit smoother with a little bit less chunks. But there's really a lot of flexibility in the texture of jams and how big or small you want those chunks to be. I always personally think throwing things in a blender makes it really easy and it makes a pretty even consistency texture. But if you want a little bit bigger chunks, you can chop that fruit up as well. All right, so preserves are kind of like a combination between a jam and a jelly. So they're going to include either small whole fruits or small chopped up chunks of fruits, typically in pretty uniform pieces, and they're going to be suspended in a clear, slightly gelled syrup. So we kind of have the chunkiness of the jam with that gelled syrup of the jelly mixed together. And with preserves, the fruit is going to be preserved with sugar, and those pieces of fruit really retain their shape pretty well. Marmalades are similar to a preserve. They're going to be on the softer side of a jelly with, again, those small pieces of fruit evenly suspended throughout. And almost always marmalades are going to have a citrus flavor to them. So they're going to contain either slices, grounds, or diced pieces of citrus fruit. And oftentimes they will include parts of the peel as well. And then conserves are basically just a jam made with either a combination of fruit or a combination of fruit and other food products. So they might contain things such as nuts, raisins, even coconut shavings, things to that extent. And then finally we have butters, and butters are a little bit different than the rest of the fruit spreads. They're going to be made with fruit juices or pulp and concentrated with sugar. And their consistency is going to be a lot thicker and a little bit less gelatinous than the rest of our fruit spreads. So it'll be more similar to a traditional butter or margarine. Butters are thickened through the evaporation of water, and a lot of times they include different spices. So for example, apple butter might include spices such as cinnamon or nutmeg. And there's a lot of different recipes out there for butters. They can be cooked in a variety of different ways. So you can cook them on the stove top, in the oven, in the microwave, and even the crock pot. But just keep in mind that a lot of those recipes are not meant to be canned afterwards. So if you want to create a shelf-stable canned product out of a butter, we just want to make sure that we're using an appropriate tested recipe for that. So a lot of times those recipes will most likely be cooked on the stove top. Some of the other ones in the oven, microwave, or crock pot are totally fine to use, but they shouldn't be necessarily canned afterwards. They should just be placed in a jar and placed directly in the refrigerator like you would a normal butter. And then they're usually good for about a month after that. So you want to keep them refrigerated and eat them up a little bit quicker than something that had been through the water bath canning process. All right, so fruit spreads in general, this is kind of minus the butters. Again, that's a little bit different. But in general, all fruit spreads contain the same 4 ingredients. So for all of them, we're going to need fruit, pectin, sugar, and acid. And it's very important that all of our recipes contain these 4 ingredients and that they contain them in the proper proportions. So these different types of ingredients work together in very specific proportions to not only make a good tasting product, but also a product that's going to be safe and a product that's going to have proper gelling and consistency. So probably overall, jams and jellies are probably one of the easiest things to can. It's a great starter if you're just getting into the canning and food preservation world. But probably overall, the biggest challenge with it is just making sure that we get that texture and consistency correct. If we don't have the proper ratio of ingredients or we don't have the proper type of fruit or something, we can have issues with either it becoming too firm or it doesn't become firm enough. So just some information on each of those 4 ingredients. First, we'll start with fruit. So with our fruit, we want to make sure that we have a nice, good quality, ripe fruit for best color and flavor. So we want our fruit to be fresh and free of damage or decay. So obviously we want, good quality fruit. But with that said, if there are a couple, if you have some peaches and there are a couple of bruised spots or maybe a couple pieces that are starting to get a little decayed, it doesn't necessarily have to be each piece of fruit be completely perfect because we are going to be chopping them up. So if there are a couple little bruised spots, we can go ahead and chop those out and discard them, but use those pieces of fruit that are going to be fresh and full of good flavor. You can also use frozen or canned fruits if the fresh is not available, but we want to look for a no sugar added option because again, those 4 ingredients with the fruit, sugar, pectin, and acid, those proportions work together very importantly to give us a safe product, a good tasting product, and a product that's going to give us that proper consistency. So we don't want to add extra sugar on top of that in our fruit. And then similarly with the jelly, you can use a canned or frozen juice in exchange for the strained fruit juice. All right, so pectin is kind of an interesting product. Pectin is a naturally occurring plant fiber. So it occurs naturally in several different types of fruits, and its biggest role is causing the fruit to gel. So when we make our jam or jelly or fruit spread, we're going to have it on the stove, and it's going to be very much in a liquid form. And we add that pectin, and that's what causes it to go from that total liquid to sort of this gel-like consistency. Some fruits, such as apples, lemons, and blackberries, contain very high amounts of pectin. So almost all commercial pectin is actually made from apples. So they're a great example of a fruit with a very high natural pectin content. So in some cases, depending on the fruit that you're using, you might not have to add a commercially produced pectin to your product, but instead you'll use the pectin that's naturally occurring in that fruit to get that gelling effect as part of your process. Typically, underripe fruits are going to contain more pectin than overripe. And like I mentioned, commercially produced pectin mostly is made from apples or citrus fruits. And then this is a very important thing to note, but there are two different types of pectin. So we have a liquid form and we have a powdered form. And they are not interchangeable within recipes. So you want to make sure before you get started that you take a look at your recipe, take a note of which type of pectin you need, and make sure that you have the proper type of pectin. There are two different types. They produce the same result in that fruit gelling, but they work in slightly different ways, and they're added in different parts of or different steps in the recipe. So in some of them, you add the sugar and then the pectin, and in other cases, you add the pectin and then the sugar. So you just want to make sure that you're following the recipe and you have the proper type of pectin before you get started, because if you have the wrong type, they're not interchangeable and you'll have to start over. All right, so some options on how to purchase pectin. There's basically two options. The first is going to be a pre-measured packet, and this packet is going to be basically pre-measured for one batch of jam or jelly or fruit spread. And that comes in both the dry and liquid form. So we can see that yellow box of Sure-Gel, that's an example of the pre-measured powdered form. And then that blue box of Certo is the pre-measured liquid form. The powdered form comes in a very similar packaging and looks very similar to like a Jello mix or a pudding mix. The liquid form is not a true liquid, so it's more like a gel, but it comes in a little squeeze pouch. And like I said, both of those are going to be pre-measured for one batch. So if you're looking for convenience and ease and you're looking to make a decent amount of jam or jelly per batch, then that's a really good option because you don't really even have to think about how much it is, and you're good to go. But if you do want a little bit more flexibility, Ball has come out with this product called the Ball Real Fruit Pectin Flex Batch. So it looks like that picture there with the green bottle. And essentially, it's just buying the powdered form in bulk. So it comes in a little bit bigger package, and it gives you the ability to measure out different concentrations of that pectin. And it gives you the ability to make a smaller batch or a larger batch, depending on how much jam or jelly you want to make that day. So if you're looking to, only make a couple jars at a time, that might be a really great option. So it gives you that flexibility, but then you do have to pay attention to the label and make sure that you're measuring out the proper amount for the amount of jam or jelly that you're making that day. All right, so reduced or no sugar pectin. I will be totally honest with you, jam and jellies, homemade, contain a lot of sugar. And that sugar content is really non-negotiable from a food safety standpoint, as well as that ratio, again, of the pectin with the sugar and the acid to make sure that we're getting the consistency we need. So if you look at a recipe of jam and you're just kind of overwhelmed by how much sugar it has, you're not interested in something with that much sugar, maybe you are diabetic or you have a diabetic in the household, there is a reduced and or no sugar pectin option. So there's a few stipulations with this. So it will say on the package, low or no sugar pectin, something to that effect. It's only available in the powdered form. So you're limited to recipes that will use that powdered form, which to be honest is the majority of recipes. So I don't think that you'll find that that is a problem, but just something to be aware of. There's no liquid pectin option for no or low sugar. Another thing to keep in mind is that the gel formation works a little bit differently. So it occurs at a low sugar concentration or in the absence of sugar using this pectin only. So the nice thing about it is it gives you complete flexibility on the amount of sugar that you want to use. So if you want to use absolutely no sugar at all, then you can do that. You just follow the recipe, don't add any sugar, and then add that pectin and continue on. You can also add any amount of sugar between no sugar and just below what a regular recipe would use. So, you know, you can use half the sugar, you can use 3/4 amount of sugar, you can use 1/4 sugar. It really gives you complete control over how much sugar you're adding to that product. So it's kind of nice because you can start adding your fruit, you can add your sugar, and you can, you know, kind of taste it along the way. If you want to add more sugar, you can taste it again till you have a texture and taste that you're happy with. And then you can add your pectin and continue on. So that's a really kind of huge plus for this product. Another plus is that it allows you to use artificial sweeteners. As a general rule of thumb, artificial sweeteners are not highly recommended or suggested for home canned products. The most research has been done using Splenda, and they find that that has the best outcome. Some of the other artificial sweeteners tend to get bitter after they're cooked down in this process, but Splenda has had mostly really good outcomes, and you can use Splenda with these reduced or no sugar pectins. You cannot use Splenda with the regular pectins. So if you're using a regular pectin, you have to use real sugar and you have to use the full amount on the recipe. So those are kind of the pros. The con to the no or low sugar pectin is that the gel formation occurs in a slightly different manner. And because of that, your texture is going to be a little bit different. So it's going to be a little bit more like a gelatin fruit product rather than a true jam or jelly. So that's kind of the trade-off. But it's definitely out there and available, and you can make the right decision for you and your family on what type of pectin and recipe you want to use. All right, so like we talked about a little bit before, certain fruits and fruit spreads have enough natural pectin in them that they don't have to have that added commercially produced pectin. So with that, if you're following one of those recipes, you'll do what's called the long boil method. And it's called this because it does take a while. This method is definitely a lot longer than the traditional added pectin recipes, but they're going to rely on the pectin naturally present in the fruit. And because of that, we want to include a little bit of underripe fruit just to make sure that we have enough pectin to get that proper gelling process. So we would recommend a ratio of about 3/4 of your fruit being totally ripe to about 1/4 of it being underripe. And again, that's because that underripe fruit is going to have more natural pectin than the ripened version. And then basically your fruit is mixed with your sugar, and you're going to cook it on your stovetop for about 30 to 45 minutes. So like I said, it's not the fastest version. Typically, our more traditional added pectin recipes are probably going to take less than 5 minutes of cooking time. So this is definitely a little bit longer, and that 30 to 45 minutes is a pretty big range of time. And so we have to decide at what point we're reaching our jellying point. And there's a couple ways we can do that. So the first is called the sheet or spoon test. And essentially all you're going to do is dip a cool metal spoon in your boiling jelly mixture. So you want to run some cold water over that spoon or stick it in the fridge or freezer for a few minutes to make sure it's really nice and cold. We're going to stick it in our boiling pot of jelly mixture, take it out, turn it to the side, and we're looking for that mixture to form 2 drops that flow together and sheet or hang off the edge of the spoon. So this is something, you know, it's definitely just like an eyeball test, and it's an inexact science. So you kind of have to get used to what you're looking for. But essentially, you know, you don't want it to be so runny that it just totally runs off the spoon the minute that you turn it. And you don't want it to be so stiff that it gets stuck to the spoon. So we're kind of looking for that last photo there, that purple spoon, where it's starting to come together into a couple different drops, and it starts to slowly hang and drop off the edge of that spoon. So it takes a little bit of practice to really know what you're looking for there, and you want to do it every couple of minutes because you don't want your jelly mixture to get too stiff, or it's going to be a tougher consistency when it's all said and done. So that's our first option. The second option is a little bit more numerical. So it's a temperature test. Basically, we're using a jelly or candy thermometer, and we're just going to boil our mixture until it reaches the temperature on this chart. It takes into account altitude, so that's really nice as well. So for us here in Pueblo County, we are at 4,600 feet. So we would just go ahead and boil that mixture until we were in the 211 to 212 degree Fahrenheit range. So if you're in a different altitude bracket there, make sure you take note of that. But this is a nice little chart, and personally, I think it's a lot easier than trying to decipher if you have the proper consistency off of a spoon. All right, so our next ingredient is going to be sugar. So obviously sugar is going to add flavor and sweetness to our fruit spread. So that's one important role, but sugar is kind of a three-for-all here. So it's not only contributing to the taste and sweetness, but it's also a very important part of that gelling process. So again, that proper proportion is really important with the pectin and acid to make sure we get a good gel. And what happens is that sugar molecules bind to the water molecules to help form a gel. So that's kind of the starting of our new texture of our fruit spread. And by binding to that water, it also acts as a preservative. So by binding to those water molecules, it makes them unavailable for any sort of microorganisms or bacteria that might be present in there. And so they're not able to survive in our fruit spreads. So it's a really important part of the food preservation process as well. And then finally, we have our acid. So this is our fourth ingredient. And again, it's necessary for the flavor and as part of that team that makes that gel formation. Acid content varies among different types of fruits. And just like the pectin is going to be higher in underripe fruits rather than fully ripe or overripe. So acid is another one that, like I said, since it varies so much among fruits, some recipes will not call for the addition of a specific acid source. So a lot of fruits are going to be naturally acidic enough that they'll just use the acid from the fruit itself, and we don't have to add that extra ingredient. But if we do need to add that acid source, pretty much it will always come in the form of lemon juice or vinegar if we're making a more savory jelly. So if you're making something like a pepper jelly or jam, most likely the recipe will call for vinegar. And with both of the lemon juice and the vinegar, we always want to make sure that we're using a commercially bottled product. And the reason for that is just to make sure that we have the proper pH and that we have the proper concentrations in our product to, again, make sure that we have a safe product as well as a product that can combine with those other ingredients to give us the consistency we're looking for. So we never want to use fresh squeezed lemon juice because the pH and acid content can vary so much between lemons. They can vary between different species of lemons. They can also vary depending on the ripeness of those lemons. And same thing with vinegar. We don't want to use a homemade vinegar product because we can't verify the pH of that. So we always want to use just a commercially bottled product for any acid source that will be required for any of our recipes. All right, so here we have some basic steps for successful canning of jams and jellies, and really successful canning steps for any type of canning product. But first, we have review a tested recipe and instructions, plan for uninterrupted time for canning, and make sure that we have allotted enough time for our canning process. Select fresh produce and purchase ingredients. And then finally, assemble equipment for preparation and water bath canning. So our first step is always to find our tested recipe and read it really thoroughly. So I know we talked about this a little bit 2 weeks ago if you joined us for that class, but a tested recipe is crucial to ensuring that we not only have a really good tasting quality product, but that it's going to be safe as well. So tested recipes are developed either at a university research lab or other certified food lab. And they undergo extensive research on all different aspects of the recipe. So they do research for taste, for tanginess, for different ingredients. They also do a lot of research and testing on the safety aspects. So the pH, altitude adjustments, water quality, water content, those things. So it's always a good idea to make sure that you know where your recipe is coming from and that it has been properly tested. So a few places that we can find these recipes are going to be with us, CSU Extension. So you can find a bunch of different recipes on our website, as well as through our Preserve Smart app. You can also find recipes with any other state extension service, including the National Center for Home Food Preservation. So this is a really great resource. They are through the University of Georgia Extension, and they have a lot of great resources on all things canning, all things jams and jellies, and really all things food preservation. And I highly recommend looking into some of their recipes. They're just really well written. They're really easy to follow. And I think it's a really great kind of beginner's tool for sure. Another place that you can find jam and jelly recipes specifically is in the pectin package inserts. So if you are purchasing those pre-packaged pectins, each of them has a package insert in them, and they all come with about 10 to 20 different recipes. So all of those are going to be tested. They have a wide variety of different fruit, jam, and jelly recipes available. And then there's also some really great recipe books out there. So the So Easy to Preserve, the Ball Blue Book, the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving, and the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning are all really great options as well. All right, so our last step before we start our canning process is going to be to assemble all of our equipment. So this is most of what you will need for jam and jelly canning. So first we're going to need our water bath canner, and that is pictured there, that gray pot with the lid. That's what a standard water bath canner looks like. If you don't want to invest in a water bath canner, you can do water bath canning with any large pot, as long as it has a well-fitting lid. It's tall enough that you can fit enough water in it that you can fill the water 2 inches over the top of the jars. And then you'll want to use some sort of jar rack in the bottom of the can. So that's something that you can purchase pretty inexpensively. But typically, this specific water bath canner model will cost you around $40. So it's not a huge investment, especially if you're looking to do a lot of food preservation. Some other equipment that you'll need include the jelly bag if you're doing jelly. So you'll need that strainer bag to get the juice from the fruit. You'll need jars and lids. So the jars can be reused over and over again as long as they stay in good condition and you don't see any cracks or chips or anything in them. The lids do have to be purchased new every time. So every time you make a batch, you will need new lids. And then those screw bands, those metal screw bands you can see in gold there, those can also be reused as long as they stay in good condition. So every season when you get your jars and lids out, you want to just take a look at them, make sure there's no chips or cracks in the jars, make sure there's no dents or rusting on the screw bands, and then those products are good to go for the next season. Some other products that are really useful, and all of these come in a little kit. So you can buy kind of a little canning starting kit, and it will include a jar lifter. So that is that product in the lower left corner with the stainless steel and the blue handle, that's where you lift the jar up with. And this is just really useful for loading jars in and out of the canner. So when the canner's going, it's going to have boiling water in it. And when you remove the jars after they've been processed, the jars are going to be boiling water hot. So it just is a safer way to remove them than using a hot pad or anything like that. The lid wand is that little blue plastic thing with the black dot on the bottom. That dot is actually a magnet, so it helps to pick up the jars lids. And that way you don't have to touch the bottom of them. You don't have any chance of contaminating the bottom of the lid with anything that may be on your hands or fingers. And you can just go ahead and apply it directly to the top of the jar. The bubble freer is that white clear plastic piece. This is not so much a key piece of equipment in jams and jellies, but in other water bath canning, it's used to just kind of agitate around the sides of the jar and make sure that any oxygen and bubbles that are trapped in there are released before we put our lid on and start processing it. And then finally, that last piece that kind of comes in that kit is going to be our funnel. And I think the funnel is probably the most useful piece here, just because, especially with jams and jellies, they can be very sticky, very messy, very runny when you're loading your jars. And so that funnel really helps to just kind of contain the mess and direct everything into the jar. And then of course you'll need just some basic kitchen equipment. So you'll need a timer, and then most likely, a cutting board, maybe a cutting knife, blender if you're going to go that route, depending on what you're making and how you're making it. But measuring cups and spoons, things like that, that we all already basically have in our kitchen. All right, and then just a note about different types of canning. So there are two different methods of canning, and the method that you're going to use is dependent on the pH of the food that you are preserving. And essentially that 4.6 pH is the threshold at which botulinum can survive at and cause botulism. So we want to make sure that we are not producing anything that might have any sort of risk with botulism poisoning, because that is a very serious consequence to improperly home canned goods. But we will be using water bath canning primarily with our jams and jellies. So that's what is used for acidic foods or foods with that pH of 4.6 or below. So that's our jams and jellies, as well as fruit products, pickled products, and acidified tomatoes. Pressure canning is our other method. This is going to be used for low acid foods or foods with that pH of above 4.6, which includes our vegetables, our meat products, and legumes. All right, so steps to water bath canning jams and jellies. So once we have our recipe and we've read it through thoroughly, we have the proper type of pectin, we have enough fruit, we have enough sugar, we've gathered all of our materials, then we're ready to really start the process. So the first thing that we're going to do is fill our canner with about halfway full with hot water. So again, this can be our water bath canner. It can be our pot with a well-fitting lid and jar rack at the bottom. And we want to fill it about halfway, but really we just want to fill it high enough that we have 2 inches of water covering those jars when we put them in. So if we're only doing, half pint jars, we probably don't need to fill it quite that high. If we're using a little bit larger of a jar, we might have to fill it a little bit more. But we want to get that hot water in our canner. We want to get it on the stove, cover it, and start preheating on the stove, because that amount of water takes a while to get to boiling. So we want to go ahead and get that process started. We also want to make sure that our jars are well heated. So the reason for this is that when we produce our jelly or jam product, it's going to be coming straight off the boiling hot stove. So we're putting a very, very hot liquid into our jars. And so if our jars are cool or even possibly room temperature, that temperature difference can actually cause breakage of our jars. So we want to make sure that our jars are well heated and that they can withstand putting that very hot liquid into them. So there's a couple options for this as well. The first is you can actually just pop those jars right into the canner and warm them up in that hot water as we're warming up the canner. So that just keeps them warm until we are ready to fill them. Another option is you can run them through the dishwasher on a hot cycle, an hour or 2 hours before you're ready to fill them. And then just go ahead and leave that dishwasher door shut, and it really retains that heat pretty well. So when you're ready to fill your jars, you can go ahead and just open up the dishwasher, remove them, and start filling them. So a couple options there. And then I see a typo here, but that should say heat lids in a small saucepan on low heat. So there's some different recommendations for the lids themselves. A lot of the packages say that the lids take no preparation. So, our recommendation has always been to follow the package directions. But what I found is even the lids that say that they don't take any preparation, if you heat them up just in a small saucepan on low heat, you don't have to boil them, they don't have to be super hot or anything. I find that you get a much better seal rate if they're just heated up a little bit. So I always do that step depending on what the package says or not. It's not going to hurt them to heat them up a little bit. And like I said, I've found that overall they seal better if they just have that little bit of heat. So I go ahead and pop them on the stove in a small saucepan and just put them on really low heat to kind of heat them up a little bit. All right, and then from there, basically all we're gonna do is make sure that we're reading our instructions in our recipe and that we're following it. So a lot of people feel really overwhelmed or kind of scared of canning, intimidated by it, but truly canning is very straightforward as long as you know that you have a good tested recipe and that you're following it very specifically. That's really the biggest thing. And if you take one thing away from this class, I hope it's that, because it's really very simple, but you want to make sure that you're doing it right and that you're following those instructions really well. So basically, this part is very dependent on what you're making. So depending on if you're making a jelly or a jam or a conserve, the recipe instructions are going to look a little bit differently, but we just want to make sure that we're preparing those fruits or juices to that recipe. And then again, we're going to add our sugar, pectin, and acid exactly as specified in the recipe. So depending on the type of pectin you're using, you might add the sugar first and then the pectin. You might add the pectin first and then the sugar. There's usually a point that you will hard boil your mixture for 1 minute. So that comes at different points in the process. But again, just making sure that you're following that recipe and that you're working reasonably quickly. So once this process starts, that pectin can get overheated, and when it gets boiled off, you're less likely to get that gelling effect. So once we kind of start this process, we want to move at a good pace so we're not destroying that pectin while we're dilly-dallying in the kitchen. And then as you create your jelly or jam mixture, sometimes it starts to create this foam on the top of the pot. And that foam is totally fine. It's totally safe to eat. It will rise to the top. So if you just go ahead and leave it and you fill your jars, all that foam will rise to the top, and probably the first 1/2 inch to 1 inch of your jar will be that foam product. But like I said, it's totally safe. It's totally edible. The texture is typically a little bit fluffier than your typical jam or jelly, but it's not a big deal. But if you don't want that foam, you can actually add a 1/4 teaspoon of butter or margarine when you're adding the rest of your ingredients, and that will help to cut down on the foam that's produced. And you can also skim off the top of the foam before you start filling your jars as well. All right, so this is just an example of a strawberry jam recipe I pulled off of that National Center for Home Food Preservation. So we can kind of go through this together. So first we have at the very top strawberry jam with powdered pectin. So first off, we know that we're going to need that powdered variety of pectin. We're going to need 5½ cups of crushed strawberries. So again, this can be just, finely chopped up, to anything from that to just thrown in the blender, and it's kind of like a strawberry smoothie concoction. But that's about 3 quart boxes of strawberries in the whole form, 1 package of the powdered pectin, and 8 cups of sugar. So like I said, typical jam and jelly recipes they have a lot of sugar in them. So 8 cups is pretty standard for what we'll see for one batch. And this batch will yield about 9 or 10 pint jars. And so from there, basically you're just going to follow the instructions. So like I said, I like how this is laid out. It has the procedure for sterilizing your jars, which we don't have to do at our elevation. We just need to make sure that they're clean. Preparing our 2-piece lid according to the manufacturer's directions. Again, I always just heat them up in a saucepan. And then we go on to preparing our fruit. So we're going to sort and wash our ripe strawberries, remove the stems and caps, and then crush them. And then this is the important part that we want to make sure we're following really carefully. So to make our jam, we're going to measure our crushed strawberries. We're going to add our pectin first and stir that together really well. Place on high heat, stirring constantly. We're going to bring it quickly to a full boil. And we're talking about a full rolling boil. So we don't want to have, just a few bubbles here and there, but we want those bubbles to cover the entire surface, and it is something that is boiling so hard that it can't be stirred down. At that point, we're going to add our sugar. And so again, 8 cups of sugar, continue stirring, heat again to that full bubbling boil, and we're going to boil hard for 1 minute, and then we're going to go ahead and remove from heat. So if we did add our margarine, hopefully we don't have too much foam, but if we do still have some foam left over, you can skim the top of it, and then you can go ahead and start filling your jars, leaving a 1/4 inch headspace, wiping our jar rims clean, and placing our canning lids on there, and then placing them in the boiling water bath canner. And this chart again is going to show our altitude adjustments. So for us here in the 1,000 to 6,000 foot range, for half pints or pints, we're going to be processing at 10 minutes. All right, so we went over a little bit of this, but so after we've followed our instructions, we've added all of our ingredients, we've boiled hard for 1 minute, removed from heat, then we're ready to start filling our jars. So we're going to remove our jars either from the dishwasher or from our canner. That's a nice picture showing our jar lifter in action. And then we're going to start filling our jars with a 1/4 inch of headspace. And headspace is important because food expands during this process. And so we just want to make sure that we have enough space available, that it's not going to cause any crackage or breakage to our jars. And so essentially the headspace is just the amount of space measured from the top of the jar to the top of the food in the jar. Headspace varies, the recommendations vary depending on the type of food that we are canning. 1/4 of an inch is fine for all jams and jellies. And usually we see all of our other water bath canned foods are going to be about a 1/2 inch, and our pressure canned foods are going to be a whole inch. So that bubble freer that I talked about earlier, if you have one of those, there is a little device on the other side of it that has a measurement device. So it looks like these little stair steps that you can place on the outside of the jar and measure the headspace. But you can also use the rings on the jar itself as kind of a guide. So that top ring on the jar is approximately 1/4 of an inch. The second ring is going to be approximately a 1/2 inch. And then the shoulder of the jar here at the base is going to be 1 inch. So you can use that as a guide as well. But we're going to fill our jars, leaving that 1/4 inch head space. And then really importantly, especially with jams and jellies, because it is so sticky and messy, we want to take either like a damp paper towel or kitchen cloth and just really wipe all of our jar rims and threads clean. We don't want there to be any stickiness or any residue or anything that gets between that jar and that lid that could affect our seal. So if anything gets under there, there's a chance that our jar might not seal. And if that's the case, then we can't store it at room temperature for that extended period of time. So we want to make sure that that's really good and clean. And then we will use our lid wand. We can see there in that middle picture to lift our lids out of that saucepan and directly on top of the lid, or on the jar, I'm sorry. So again, we want to make sure that we're not touching the bottom of the lid or we're not placing it on anything, and that it stays really clean, that there's nothing that's going to be between that seal, again, of the lid and the jar. And then we're going to apply one of our screw bands to fingertip tight. So we don't want to put our screw bands on and crank it on really tight, because if it's on too tight during the water bath canning process, the lid will actually buckle over that screw band, and you won't be able to open the jar. And you'll actually have to just throw away the whole jar and all the product. So looser is actually better, which is kind of counterintuitive. You want to make sure it's on there securely, but really it should just be on there tight enough that you could undo it with just your fingertips. So just screw it on until you start to feel a little bit of resistance, and that's all the tighter that you need to go. So once we have all of our jars filled, our lids and screw bands on, then we're going to take our jar lifter again and place the jars in the canner without tilting them. So once our jars are full and our lids are on, we want to disturb those jars as little as possible. So again, by tilting them back and forth, placing them upside down, anything like that, that's increasing the chance that something can get in between that jar and that lid and affect our seal. So we want to try to lift our jars straight up, straight over, and straight down into the canner, just disturbing them as little as possible. And then again, we'll lower our jars into the canner and make sure that the water is covering by at least 1 to 2 inches over the tops of those jars. So if we find that we don't have enough water, now's the time to add a little bit more. And then we'll go ahead and place our lid back on the canner and bring to, again, a full rolling boil. So this can take a little bit of time if it's not properly heated up from the start of all of this, but we want to make sure that as long as it takes, we're waiting that amount of time before we start our timer. So you can check it periodically, but we really want it to be a full raging rolling boil before we start our timer. So once it's bubbling all the way across the top of that canner, then we can start our timer for our processing time. And again, making sure that those are properly altitude adjusted. So for us here in Colorado, most jams and jellies, we're going to be processing for 10 minutes. So after the processing time has gone through, so we've done our 10 minutes, you can go ahead and turn off the heat, remove the lid. Always remove the lid away from your face, because there is a lot of steam that has pent up in that canner. So we don't want that to steam in our face. And then we'll go ahead and just wait about 5 to 10 minutes to let everything kind of cool down a little bit. And then we'll use our jar lifter to remove our jars from the canner. So just like when we were loading them, we want to just try to disturb them as little as possible, keeping them upright. And we'll go ahead and set them on either a towel or some sort of cooling rack on your counter. So you don't want to place them directly on the countertop, for the same reason that we wanted our jars heated up before we put anything in them. Especially if you're doing this in the middle of summer and you have your air conditioning running, your countertops can get really cool. And so if we place a boiling hot product on a cool countertop, it can cause breakage of our glass. So by just putting down a cooling rack or a towel, something super easy, it'll eliminate that hazard. All right. So after we've removed our jars from the canner, we're basically just going to leave them as undisturbed as possible for about 12 to 24 hours. And our hope is that they will all properly seal in that amount of time. So we don't want to, disturb the bands. We don't want to be pressing or playing with the lids. We just want to allow them to naturally seal themselves. After about 12 to 24 hours, we can check them. You can check the lids for a seal by gently placing your finger over the middle of the lid. You should feel an indent in that lid if it's properly sealed. And sometimes, you'll start taking them out of the canner and you'll start hearing that ping sound immediately, and you'll know some of them are starting to seal. Some of them seal within 5 seconds of taking them out of the canner. Some of them truly do take 12 to 24 hours. So if you find that you take them all out of the canner and none of them seal immediately, don't get discouraged. Some of them just do take a little bit longer. But we want to make sure that they're properly sealed before we store them. So like I said, run your finger over the top of that jar and feel for that indent. We want to be careful pressing it down in the middle too hard, because sometimes if you press it down, it'll stay down, and that indent is there and it feels like it's sealed, but really, you pushed it down and it just didn't pop back up. So we want to make sure it's doing it on its own and that it's truly sealed. You can also look at it just at eye level, and you can a lot of times see that indent in it as well. But it should be slightly curved down in the center of the lid. All right, so our final steps, once our jars are sealed, we actually want to remove the screw bands. So the screw bands are great for keeping the lid in place during the processing time. They're good if you're going to be transporting the foods a longer period of distance. They are nice if you're making, decorations or giving them as gifts, but really the screw bands don't serve any function in the actual preservation sealing process. So by removing the screw bands, it's a lot easier to tell if for some reason something went wrong while it's sitting in your pantry and that seal breaks. It's a lot more obvious than if it's screwed down with that screw band. So we recommend just removing those, only using them for processing time or transport. You can clean the outside of your jars. So if there's any sort of sticky residue or anything on the outside, you can go ahead and wipe that off. And then we always want to label our contents. So we want to make sure that we have the name of our product or what it is, the method that was used. So if it was water bath canning or pressure canning, and then the date. So you can either put the date, processed on today's date, or you can put a best by date. So best by a year from today's date. And then just like any other canned good, we want to store it in a cool, dry, dark place. And best quality is going to be if used within a year. So if the seal is not broken, you can go a little bit over a year, but typically we like to use up our home canned goods by a year mark. All right, so just some final tips for success. We always want to prepare our fruit spreads in small batches. So, if you're making a lot of fruit spreads, it's tempting to throw in a double recipe, but those ratios and those cook times are very specific to that recipe. So, while the ratio might be the same if you double the recipe, the cook time is going to be different if you have that much more product in it. So we always recommend just doing one batch at a time, following that recipe explicitly, only using that ratio of ingredients and those cook times to ensure that we get a good product and that it's going to gel properly. Another tip would just be to measure our ingredients accurately and do not reduce or increase ingredients. So again, those ratios are very important to make a safe product, a good tasting product, and a product with that proper gel consistency. So we don't want to be messing with the amount of sugar or acid or pectin or anything like that. The only caveat to that is if you do choose to use that low or no sugar pectin option. Another tip is to, work quickly once you start this process, boil rapidly. I mentioned this earlier, but that slow boiling or heating for a long period of time starts to destroy the pectin, and that's going to affect your texture and consistency. All of these recipes must be processed in a boiling water bath canner to make sure that they are shelf stable and safe to store in your pantry for that year amount of time. And then finally, again, just following those instructions explicitly. So making sure that we are using the proper amounts of all the ingredients and that we're following those instructions that the recipe suggests. All right, so we've talked a lot about this gelling factor, the texture, the consistency. So what happens if we make a batch and it just doesn't set right? So there are options to remake it. There are some caveats with that. If you want to remake a jam or jelly that doesn't set, you want to follow the same instructions on the pectin packet or insert or reliable canning book that you used before. You basically have to start over. So you're going to empty all your jars back onto the stove top. You're going to add the same amount of pectin, the same amount of sugar, and the same amount of acid as the first time. So, if the first batch had 8 cups of sugar, the remade batch is going to have 16 cups of sugar. So we're getting into a lot of sugar here. The flavor might be affected by the additional ingredients. And sometimes when you remake them, it kind of overcompensates and the end product becomes even a little bit too tough or stiff due to that additional processing. So it definitely can be done and it's an option, but the outcome might not be exactly what you're hoping for either. So if you do have a jam or jelly recipe that doesn't set right, you might just repurpose it as like a syrup. You can use these products on ice cream, you can use them in yogurt, you can stir them into smoothies. So instead of doing all that extra work for, a subpar product in the end, you might just try to get creative with that. Another option, so if you're looking at this and you're thinking the water bath canning seems kind of overwhelming and maybe not the route you want to go, there is an option for freezer jams and jellies. So freezer jams and jellies have their own recipes and their own pectin. So just like the low or no sugar option pectin, there's a freezer jam pectin as well. And it's very clearly labeled, and that is what you will want to use if you're doing any sort of freezer jam. But you'll follow the freezer jam specific recipes. Usually they're not cooked, so they're not heated up on the stovetop. Usually it's just mixed together with those same 4 ingredients that we use in all of our fruit spreads. And then they are stored in the freezer. So so you freeze them in, canning jars are freezer safe, so you can still load them in the jars if you want, or you can store them in freezer safe Tupperware or other freezer safe containers. But they're good in the freezer for about that year mark, as just like our regular canned goods. Or you can just place them directly in the refrigerator for a few weeks. So that's another option, like I said, if you're not interested in the full canning process. Some processes not recommended for canning. So open kettle canning is the process where you don't actually process them through the water bath canner, but you just use the heat of the jar and the food in the jar to seal the lid. But with this method, temperatures are not high enough to destroy certain microorganisms that can cause foodborne illness. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that. The paraffin wax seals are another thing that are very popular with some people, that they think they don't have to do the full water bath canning process, and we can still get that jar going to be, sorry, that jar that's going to be safe at room temperature without going through that whole process because we have that wax seal on top. But that wax seal is really not airtight. It does allow a lot of bacteria and microorganisms in. It can definitely allow for mold to grow in the product as well. And then glass and zinc caps, as well as Tatler lids, are all reusable, different types of lids. So like I mentioned earlier, those metal rings or those metal lids are only good one time. So these are a little bit more economic maybe, or a little bit more eco-friendly, but unfortunately they just don't work as well. So it's a lot harder to tell if they're properly sealed. They don't seal as well a lot of times. And there's just not a lot of research out there on them. So I wouldn't recommend using any of those. Like I said, you can always reuse the jars a lot of different times, as well as the screw bands. So the investment in the lids every year is pretty minimal, and the waste is pretty minimal as well. All right, so with that, I will take any questions. I know that was a lot of information, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we will go ahead and stop sharing that. All right. So let's see. No questions so far. And if you guys think of any questions, you can always email me directly or call me, and I will be happy to answer them that way as well. If you take the lids out of the pan, does the water on the lid affect the product? Not really. Usually you might just kind of shake it off a little bit to try to get any major excess water off of it. But overall, no, that's not an issue. All right. Not seeing too many questions today, so that's okay. Well, if you guys think of any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And like I said, you'll be getting that follow-up email. You said the jars don't require sterilization because of the altitude. Why is this? Yes. So basically, if you live at sea level, you have to sterilize your jars. The minimum amount of time of processing to properly sterilize our jars is boiling them for 10 minutes. And so living at our elevation, we have to process everything for at least 10 minutes. So we can sterilize our jars in that 10 minutes of processing time. So basically, we can sterilize our jars while processing our food at the same time. If we were living at a lower elevation and we were only processing our jams and jellies for 5 minutes, then we would want to specifically sterilize them beforehand. Yeah, I mean, the old research did show that we were sterilizing our jars all across the country, no matter where you were in elevation. But most recently, we have decided that we don't have to sterilize our jars anymore. And that is the widely accepted method for those of us who live at any sort of elevation. Another little tip I'll give you guys is a lot of the canning products are packaged and produced at sea level, and then they're shipped to us at elevation. So a lot of our lids, if you buy like a package of jars with lids and screw bands, a lot of those lids actually get sealed in transport. So if you open up a brand new set of jars and you pop the lid off, and it makes that popping sound that you hear when you open a new jar that has been processed, then that lid has actually already sealed to that jar and it's probably not going to seal again when you make your first batch of whatever you're making. So I always recommend living at our elevation that you just start with new lids right off the bat, even if you have a new set of jars and they come with lids, because a lot of times they'll seal in transport. All right. Does it make a difference between using white vinegar or apple cider vinegar? Nope. As long as the acidity is at least 5%, which pretty much all commercially produced vinegars are. The only thing is it might affect the taste a little bit. So if you like that taste of the apple cider vinegar or the white vinegar, then you can feel free to use whichever. Sometimes with pickles and stuff, the darker vinegars can also affect the color of the brine. So that's something to be aware of too. If you get a darker brine, is it because of your vinegar or is it because of something went wrong? All right. So if there's no other questions, like I said, you'll be getting that follow-up email by the end of the week. You'll have access to this recording in this class for 30 days, as well as lots of other great resources. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you again in a couple weeks on water bath canning.